Rational expressions. Solving equations with rational expressions. With me, Catherine. If you're in my class after this video, you can complete Rational Expressions Part 2, Problems 5 through 12. After completing all of the practice problems, you're ready for the practice test. After earning 80% or higher on the practice test, you are ready for the take-home test. Remember, it's going to be the online graded test. You have 3 attempts. Each attempt must be completed in one sitting. That means you cannot close the test and then return. Let's get started. Identify each of the following as an expression or an equation. You might remember from other lectures or videos that A is an expression. That's because it does not have an equal sign. B is actually an equation because it has an equal sign. In this video, we're going to be solving equations. Solving an equation with multiple variables for one of the variables. First, you have to factor all of the denominators, if you can. Find a common denominator. Multiply to clear the fractions by multiplying each piece of the equation by the common denominator. Use distributive property to remove grouping symbols. Combine like terms to simplify each side. Get all the terms containing the specific variable on the same side of the equation and everything else on the other side. Basically, we're starting algebra here. Then isolate the specified variable and then check for extraneous answers. No problem, right? Let's look at our first equation. We're going to solve, then check the proposed solution. The reason we're saying proposed solution is that it could be an extraneous solution. That means it doesn't work. So the first thing we have to do is factor the denominators. Well, in this case, we have y minus 4, so we don't need to do anything. So what is our common denominator or denominators? It's just y minus 4. Next, we're going to multiply to clear the fractions. That means I'm going to multiply both of them by the common denominator. In this case, we can cancel some stuff. Once we cancel, it turns out that y equals 4. We didn't have the distributive property, so we didn't need to worry about that. We didn't need to combine like terms because it was already simplified. And we have the variable on one side. Now we have to check for extraneous solutions or answers. That means we have to substitute 4 back into the denominator. Hopefully you remember that the denominator cannot equal 0. We need to check that our solutions will not make the denominator 0. We only care about the denominator, by the way. So what we do is we put 4 in for y. Well, 4 minus 4 is 0, and we can't have that. Guess what? Y can't equal 4, so there is no solution. So we just put the empty set there. Let's look at another one. First, we have to factor the denominators. Well, in this case, we just have x minus 5. So that means our common denominator is x minus 5. Next, we need to multiply to clear the fractions. Remember, we're going to multiply everything by our denominator. So I'm going to take 2 times x minus 5, 5 times x minus 5, and 13 times x minus 5. Then we're going to cancel anything we can. That's kind of the fun part, right? So there we go. So now we have 2 equals 5 times x minus 5 minus 13. Now, if we have it, we need to use the distributive property. So let's do that. 5 times x is 5x, and 5 times negative 5 is negative 25. Let's combine like terms. Now we have 5x minus 38. We need to have the variable on one side and everything else on the other side. This is really algebra from here on out. We're going to add 38 to both sides, and then we have to get x really by itself. That's when we isolate the variable. So we need to divide by 5, and it turns out that x is 8. To make sure that our answer doesn't make the denominator 0. That means I have to put 8 into all the x's in the bottom. Well, in this case, we just have x minus 5. Well, 8 minus 5 is actually 3, and it doesn't make it 0. So guess what? 8 is our answer. Let's look at another one. For this one, the first thing we have to do is factor the denominators. So we have x squared minus 9. That means I have to find things that multiply to negative 9 that add to 0. Well, in this case, that's x minus 3 and x plus 3. When we look at the other denominators, we have an x plus 3 and an x minus 3. So what's our common denominator going to be? Well, we're going to line up the denominators, just like that. We're going to make a square around everything. I don't know why I keep saying circle, but a square. And it turns out that our common denominator is going to be x minus 3 and x plus 3. So our next step is to actually multiply each piece by x minus 3 times x plus 3. Then we're going to cancel. Like I said, this is kind of the fun part. We get rid of a lot of stuff. Now let's see what we're left with. 4 plus 1 times x minus 3 equals 2 times x plus 3. Now we need to use the distributive property to remove the grouping symbols or the parentheses. So I take 1 times x is x or 1x, 1 times negative 3 is negative 3, 2 times x is 2x, and 2 times 3 is 6. Now I need to combine like terms. Well, on the left side, 4x plus x is actually 5x. Now I need to get the variable on one side and everything else on the other side. What I like to do is put all the x's on the left side, so let's do that first. I'm going to subtract 2x from both sides, which leaves me with 3x minus 3 equals 6. But I really need to get 3x by itself. So now I'm going to add 3 to both sides, which gives us 3x equals 9. Next, we need to actually solve for x. So now look in the middle of the screen. I have 3x equals 9. I'm going to divide by 3 on both sides, which gives me x equals 3. Now we need to check for extraneous answers or solutions. That means we're going to look at all of the denominators. Any denominator cannot equal 0. It only takes 1. So I happen to notice that x minus 3, when I put my answer 3 in there, I end up with 0. Well, guess what? That means there's no solution for this equation. Let's look at the next example. Once again, we're going to solve, and then we have to check the proposed solution. First, we have to factor the denominators. Well, z squared minus 3z minus 10 means I have to find numbers, actually, not things, numbers that multiply to negative 10 that add to negative 3. For this one, we end up with z minus 5 times z plus 2. 2z plus 4. Well, now we have to find the common factor. 2z equals 2 times z, and 4 equals 2 times 2. When I circle my common factor, or greatest common factor, I end up with 2. So I put a 2 with the parentheses, I divide each term by 2, and I end up with 2 times z plus 2. Finally, we have 2z minus 10. We're going to do the same thing. 2z equals 2 times z, and negative 10 equals negative 1 times 2 times 5. When we circle the greatest common factor, we end up with 2. So what we're going to do is write 2 and a parentheses. We're going to divide by 2, and we end up with z minus 5. The next thing I like to do is rewrite everything so the denominators are factored. Next, we're going to figure out, well, what is the common denominator or denominators? So what we do is write each of the factors out. Then we're going to circle, or in this case, square, everything that's in common. So it turns out that 2 times z minus 5 times z plus 2 is our common denominator. Now, we need to multiply to clear the fractions. That means I'm multiplying each fraction by 2 times z minus 5 times z plus 2. You'll notice that in the blue parts. Now we get to cancel, which of course is the fun part because we get rid of a lot of stuff. All right, let's see what we have left. We have 2 plus 1 times z minus 5 equals 2 times z plus 2. If we look over here, 1 times 2 is where I get my 2. Now here it's a little hard to see, but I only canceled out my 2. So I really have 1 times z minus 5. Now we're going to use the distributive property to get rid of our parentheses. 1 times z is z. 1 times negative 5 is negative 5. 2 times z is 2z, and 2 times 2 is 4. We're going to collect like terms next, and 2 minus 5 is negative 3 on the left side. Now I like to get all the z's on the left side, or the variables, and everything else on the right side. So now I'm going to subtract 2z from both sides. This gives me negative z minus 3 equals 4. I need to add 3 to both sides, which gives me negative z equals 7. But I still need to isolate the variable. I don't want to know what negative z is. I want to know what positive z is. That means I'm going to divide by negative 1 on both sides. So now we think the answer is negative 7. Remember, we have to check the proposed solution. So let's go up and look at our common denominators. So I have z minus 5 and z plus 2. If I put negative 7 in for the first z, negative 7 minus 5 isn't 0. That's good. Negative 7 plus 2 isn't 0, and that's good. And the same is true here. Negative 7 plus 2 isn't 0, and negative 7 minus 5 is also not 0, which means z equals negative 7 is our solution. I want you to pause the video, try this one, and then press play to check. Okay, let's see how you did. The first thing we have to do is factor the denominators. So the first one, x squared minus x minus 2, we need to think of things that multiply, or numbers that multiply to negative 2 that also add to negative 1. Well, that's x minus 2 times x plus 1. Next, we have x squared minus 2x minus 3. For this one, we have to think of numbers that multiply to negative 3 but add to negative 2. For this one, we have x minus 3 and x plus 1. Next, let's write it with the factored denominators. Let's put all of our denominators here, x minus 2 and x plus 1, and then x minus 3 and x plus 1. We're going to put a box around all of the denominators. So it turns out that our common denominator is going to be x minus 2 times x minus 3 times x plus 1. And you got it. We're going to multiply everything by x minus 2 times x minus 3 times x plus 1. But this is where the fun starts. We're going to start canceling everything that's in common. So let's see what we have left. 3 times x minus 3 equals 30 times x minus 3 minus 28 times x minus 2. Next, the distributive property. We end up with 3x minus 9 equals 30x minus 90 minus 28x plus 56. On the right side, let's combine like terms. 30x minus 28x is 2x. Negative 90 plus 56 is negative 34. Now, we need to get the variables on the left side, well, I like the left side, and everything else on the right side. To do it a little different, I decided to add 9 to both sides first. Now, we're going to subtract 2x from both sides, and we end up with x equals negative 25. Remember, this is our possible solution. So let's look at our denominators. X minus 2. Well, if I put negative 25 in for x, I don't get 0. That's a good thing. When I put negative 25 into x plus 1, I don't get 0. That's also a good thing. And the same is for this denominator because they're the same. Now, negative 25 minus 3 isn't 0. And negative 25 plus 1 isn't 0 also. So guess what? This is our solution. How'd you do? Now it's your turn. Pause the video, find the solution, and press play to check. All right, let's see how you did. The first thing we had to do is factor the denominators. X squared minus 3x minus 4. We need to think of things that multiply to negative 4 that add to negative 3. It turns out that's x minus 4 and x plus 1. So it's pretty easy to see that our common denominator is going to be x minus 4 times x plus 1. So what I did was I multiplied everything by our common denominator. Hopefully you notice right here that I did factor this denominator. It's going to come in handy right now because what we're going to do is start canceling everything that's the same. So what are we left with? 1 times x plus 1, 1 times x minus 4, and that will equal 5x. When we distribute, we have x plus 1 plus x minus 4 equals 5x. Let's combine like terms. X plus x is 2x, and 1 minus 4 is negative 3. Since 5x is by itself on the right side, I'm going to subtract 2x from both sides. This gives us negative 3 equals 3x. Next, we're going to divide by 3 on both sides. This gives us x equals negative 1. Next, we have to check because this is only a possible solution. So let's look at our denominators. The first one is x minus 4. Well, negative 1 minus 4 is not 0, so that's okay. But negative 1 plus 1 is 0, and that's not okay. So what does that mean? That means there's no solution for this equation. Now it's time to practice. You could do the rational expressions part 2, problems 5 through 12. After completing all of the practice problems, you're ready to do the practice test. Cool. After earning 80% or higher on the practice test, you are ready for the take-home online graded test. Now remember, you only have 3 attempts. Each attempt must be completed in one sitting. That means you cannot close the test and return to it later. If you do close it, that counts as one attempt. I hope you like this video, and hopefully we'll see each other real soon.